Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, Bare Knuckles, Mickey Mouse, and Bury Me With My Money. I'm your host, Jared, and today is December 23rd, 1992. More arcade favorites make its way to households. Released this week in 1992 was Sunset Riders for the Sega Genesis. Sunset Riders is a run-and-gun game set in the Wild West. Move to the right while shooting everything that isn't you. Shoot other cowboys, collect power-ups, dodge or exploit the occasional exploding barrel, and sometimes go into the nearby saloon for a quick smooch from the local dancing girls. At the end of each stage, you'll face off against a boss and sometimes get bonus stages to rack up additional points. Sunset Riders was originally released for the arcades in 1991 from Konami. There, it became an instant favorite, notably because it was 4-player co-op, a growing trend for Konami arcade games at the time. Even better, the 4 playable characters all had different characteristics. Steve and Billy use the classic 6-shooter revolvers, and when they get the second gun power-up, they hold the other at a 45-degree angle. Bob uses a rifle and Cormano has a shotgun, both that fire slower but has a wide bullet spread. The Sega Genesis version, however, doesn't have all that. It was ported onto a cartridge size of only 4 megs, meaning only 2 playable characters are available, Billy and Cormano. Level designs were also drastically altered, and while the arcade original had 8 stages with 8 bosses, the Genesis version has 4 stages, split to 2 sections each, and only 4 bosses, and different bonus stages. Perhaps the most disappointing cuts are the numerous boss speeches they say when they die. Those were hilarious.
Hasta la bye-bye. Marry me with my money.
However, the Sega port does feature something that is not available on any other version of Sunset Riders: a 2-player versus mode. Not that anyone played it for the versus mode, it was meant for co-op through and through. Konami has a reserved history for the Sega Genesis. Though the system had been out for a few years already, Konami had trepidations about developing for it, instead making it clear that their main priority was the Super NES. The very first game that Konami made for the Sega Genesis was Sunset Riders, and was only available in North America. Not wanting to gamble too much on an unproven property, they kept the budget for the Sunset Riders port intentionally small, thus the smaller cartridge and the lack of fanfare and advertising for the game. For what it's worth though, Konami changed their tune about Sega with the release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist. So like a week from now. Sunset Riders in the arcade became an instant classic and was widely loved. The Sega Genesis Sunset Riders was received still pretty good. GamePro magazine awarded it 4 out of 5s in every category, and GameFan magazine put it with 93% scores. While good for its time, the Genesis port is considered to be the most inferior. In mid-1993, Sunset Riders would arrive on the Super Nintendo and would be arcade accurate, from stages to playable characters to voice samples. And the arcade version can be played now on the PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch from their online stores. Sega kept the hits coming. Released December 20th, 1992, was Streets of Rage 2 for the Sega Genesis. Streets of Rage 2 is a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you fight waves of enemies while walking to the right. Play as returning characters Axel and Blaze, along with 2 new characters, Max and Skate. Pick up weapons to use against enemies, all while enjoying the amazing synthwave atmosphere with neon lights all over the place. You can still grab enemies, do that thing where you flip over them to throw them, and use a variety of special moves. Streets of Rage 2 is a first-party title from Sega for their hardware and is better than the original game in every conceivable way, being the first 16 meg cartridge for the system. The sprites are bigger, there are even more enemies, the atmosphere is even better, there are more attacks, and it's incredibly well balanced. It also has some of the best music of any video game of the era. Seriously, give the soundtrack a listen, and all of those songs absolutely hold up to today's synthwave standards. It may sound trendy now, but back then, the music was considered revolutionary, one of the many ways it was ahead of its time. The first Streets of Rage was released in September of 1991, right at the same time as the release of the Super Nintendo. It was seen as Sega's answer to Final Fight, which was coming out for the SNES just a couple of months later. Arguably, Streets of Rage 2 is better than any of the SNES Final Fight games. It's considered to be that good. To this day, it's widely considered to be one of the best beat-em-up games of all time, and one of the best Sega Genesis games you can find. It sold incredibly well despite such a late holiday release. Video game retail store Babbage's reported that it was in the top 5 best-selling Sega Genesis games all the way through March of 1993. There would be a Streets of Rage 3 in early 1994, but then the series lay dormant for decades. It was included in online stores and compilations, but not a true sequel was in sight. Did you ever see that weird PS1 game in the late 90s called Fighting Force? That was originally supposed to be Streets of Rage 4. Of course, we know now in the future that there would finally be a Streets of Rage 4 in 2020. Good games can come from unexpected mascots. Released this week in 1992 was The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse for the Super Nintendo. The Magical Quest sees Mickey Mouse on an adventure to rescue his dog Pluto, who has run off during a game of fetch, which is Goofy's fault. It's a side-scrolling platformer which has Mickey jumping and taking out enemies by either jumping on them or by throwing objects and enemies themselves. The further you get into the game, the more magic costumes you get for Mickey. The firefighter can use the water hose to take out enemies, the magician can shoot a magical blast, and the mountain climber gets a grappling hook. You can swap between them at any time, and they're used differently for a lot of platformer elements. For example, the firefighter hose makes ice platforms in the ice level. The Magical Quest was developed and published by Capcom, and is the first Disney game from Capcom for the SNES. It predates other beloved Disney SNES games like Aladdin and Goof Troop. It's also a visually impressive game for the SNES. Huge, well-animated character sprites that evoke that Disney feel really well, with some varied level designs and boss fights. It's also a quick, chill playthrough. There's unlimited continues, and it isn't very difficult, which honestly works well since it's such a relaxing game to play, and it's one of those better than it looks kind of games. A well-made Disney game coming to the SNES was seen as a big enough deal that it graced the cover of Nintendo Power issue 44, complete with a multi-page walkthrough. It also reviewed super well. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it straight 9s out of 10, calling it one of the most visually impressive games they've seen yet. GamePro magazine also liked it a lot, aside from the music.
Side note, I actually kind of agree with that. So many things sound like a fart in this game.
The Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse sold near 1.2 million copies and became the first part in a trilogy. Magical Quest 2, The Great Circus Mystery, would grace the SNES and Genesis in 1994, and there would be a Magical Quest 3 for the Super Famicom, though all 3 would get ported to the Game Boy Advance in early 2000s. As for the ton of other games this week, here's Editor Dylan.
How about a quick round of Jeopardy? The British call these bangers. Yeah, what is every song from Streets of Rage 2? Nailed it. That question was a pushover, and so is this next game. Pushover has you setting up and knocking down dominoes. That's it. That's all I got. Transitions are hard. Gods is an action side-scroller starring a big, beefy, purple tights-wearing masked man with a ponytail and a seemingly infinite amount of knives. Quick, name an 80s action movie that didn't need an SNES game. Correct. Here's a Steam code. Unfortunately, Lethal Weapon came out this week anyway. Want to try again? Okay, this time, name a Game Boy game based on a 90s action movie that was actually kinda fun. Okay, if you said Universal Soldier starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, then that is correct, but I'm sorry, I just don't believe you. How do you remember these things? Here's a freaking, let's see, what do I got here? I guess I have some PS3 codes? Yeah, try that, see if that works. That game's okay, but Bonk's Adventure for the Game Boy blows it out of the water this week. I always love the expressive faces and transformations in the Bonk series, and thankfully, that's all intact here. Meanwhile, The Humans is pretty much just Lemmings, but, you know, with humans, for the Game Boy. I'm pretty sure that's exactly how the pitch for this game went. Lotus Turbo Challenge released on the Genesis this week, and when it comes to racing games, it's definitely one of them. But no time to dwell on that because we got a sports game to cover. Who's hyped? The main attraction this week, according to this magazine ad, released on December 18th, 1992. And that was Jerry Glanville's Pigskin Foot Brawl. don't say I never did anything for you. Pigskin 621 AD was an arcade game based around football in the before times. The developers, Razorsoft, asked the titular Atlanta Falcons coach if he wanted to be in the Genesis version. And because old Jerry was such a huge fan of the original, or at least his kids played it once and thought, hey, that killed some time, he said, what the hell, and agreed. It sounds like I'm lying, but that's pretty much what happened in this interview I found. But they don't call it foot brawl for nothing. Being set in ancient barbarian times, their words not mine, each team is armed with weapons, rocks, and nooses? Holy sh**. Make sure the pigskin gets to the other side of the field by any means necessary. That means punching, kicking, killing, whatever. But if one team starts doing too well, they summon a troll to even the odds. Now that's what football was missing all these years. Thank you, Mr. Glanville. You have truly blessed us with the natural evolution of the sport. In the name of the E, the S, the P, and the N, bless you, sir. Amen. And while I'm at it, sweet voice work, by the way.
Let's kick some butt. Ow.
A staggering 12 games came out for these three consoles this week in 1992. I figured since it's the holiday season and all, I'd give the people what they wanted and dedicate most of this segment to a game I wouldn't usually cover. That said, RFR was supposed to be a first impressions kind of thing, with one, maybe two sentences tops. But if a game surprises me, I try not to gloss over it. Thankfully, you guys let us know whenever that happens in the comments, so I can right my wrongs and put them in the outro section. Until then, have a happy holiday and a merry and berry pie. It's delicious.
Thanks, Dylan. In the Collector's Corner, Sunset Riders for the Genesis is one of the better value Sega games. The loose cartridge is still worth about $45, and a complete copy is over $120. Streets of Rage 2 sold so many copies, it's easy to find, which is a great deal. A cartridge goes for around $23, and a complete one is just over $50. Magical Quest sold millions of copies, which means it's easy to find. It's worth a meager $18, and having a box and manual with it only brings it up to $60. And that's it for today. Next week, Motorcycle Combat, TURTLE Power, and Mega Man. Again, I'm your host Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you so much for watching Now in the 90s. Please like the video and leave a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you already are a subscriber, thank you so much. When you played Sunset Riders, did you have a favorite guy that you always went through? I personally always went for Billy, but then anytime as a kid when I went to play it again, I kept getting confused by the characters. And then I realized that's because I was actually playing the Cowboys of Moo Mesa.